In this video, we will talk about graphing functions on the TI-84. After all, this is a graphing calculator, so we should be able to make graphs on it. So again, here is our TI-84. So let's graph some functions. The appropriate keys here that you will want to keep in mind, there is the y equal key. That is where you define the functions that you want to graph. There is the graph key. That's the key you push to make the graph. And here, window and zoom. Those are the keys you use to control what the window on your calculator looks like, what part of the graph that you will actually see. So let's practice. So we will press the y equal button. So the screen comes up. You'll notice you can plot many functions at one time. Let's just concentrate on one. So let's graph x squared. And remember, there is your variable key. That's the key you use to get x. So let's press x and squared. Press enter to tell the calculator that we're done. And now to see the graph, we want to press the graph button. And there is the graph of y equals x squared. Now, if your graph does not look like this, you might be viewing your graph in a different window. So let me show you something that's very handy right away. We are going to use the zoom button, and we are going to use the option zoom standard. Now, there are two ways to get to this. You can notice it is option 6 on the zoom menu. So you can either press the number 6, or you can use the arrow key to scroll down to the number 6. I'll just press the number 6. It regraphs. The zoom standard button takes you into a window where the x goes from -10 to 10, and the y goes from -10 to 10. So that's called the standard window. So if your graph didn't look like what our graph looked like, you can try zoom standard. It's always a good idea to use zoom standard when you're starting out with a graph, just to get a quick look. So we have a function there. Now, functions are typed in, as you might think, but there are some special functions, and one of the special functions is the absolute value function, which you might know as this. Okay. So how do we get that on our calculator? Well, we'll go back to y equals, and you'll notice it takes us back to y1. Now, if we don't want that anymore, we'll just press the clear key to get rid of that function. And let's get the absolute value function. There is no key for it, but we can get to it through the math menu, the math key. So let's press that. You'll remember we got to the fraction command from this. But the absolute value key is under the num menu, the numerical menu. So we'll use the arrow key to move over to that. And you'll notice the first one there is ABS. That stands for absolute value. So you can either press the number 1, or since the number 1 is highlighted, you can press enter. I'll press 1. And depending on your model of calculator, you'll notice my calculator has the 2 bars there, and I can enter X. And you'll notice it's waiting for me to type more inside of the absolute value. If I am done inside the absolute value, press the arrow key to get out of it. And now I can press enter. Now, on some calculators, you might not see the absolute value bars there. On some calculators, you might actually see A, B, S, X. And that's okay. That's just a different version of the calculator. And now if we press graph, we will see the graph of the absolute value of X in the standard window. Okay. There is another special function that we might use in this class, or you might use in a future calculus class, and that is called the greatest integer function. What this function does is give the greatest integer that is less than or equal to the given number. So if we would apply this function to 4.5, the largest integer that is less than that is 4. There are many integers that are less than 4.5, but we want the greatest integer that is less than that. So the greatest integer function would give us 4. So let's see how we can get that on the calculator. So let's go back to y equals. Clear out the function we have in there. And how do we get to the greatest integer function? Well, we'll use the math menu again. We use the arrow key to go over to the numeric menu. And the greatest integer function is option 5, int. So again, you can either use the arrows to scroll down to 5 and press enter, or just push the number 5. Now see, here's an example where there is no special symbol for it, it just says int. So we'll enter our variable x, don't forget to close the parentheses, and then we'll push graph. So you can see there is the graph of the greatest integer function, sometimes known as a step function because you can see it looks like steps. Now we'll talk about this in class, that this is not a completely accurate representation of that function, but we'll talk about the details of that in class. There are other special kinds of functions that we will want to look at, and they are called piecewise defined functions. And these are functions that are just what the name says. They are functions that are defined in pieces. So for example, if we have this function, this would be a piecewise defined function. The function is defined as 3x minus 1 if x is less than 1, and the function is defined by 2x plus 5 if x is greater than or equal to 1. So this function is defined in 2 pieces. So how can we graph that on our calculator? Okay, let's go back. Let me go back to y equals. We will clear the function we have there. Let me clear the history screen over here for you. So how do we type in this function? To be a little bit careful, we'll use our parentheses. You first use parentheses to type in the first piece. So if you'll recall, our first piece was 3x minus 1. So we will type in 3 times x minus 1. Then we'll close the parentheses. Okay. And now we will put in parentheses after our first piece the conditions on that first piece. So we'll open our parentheses. The conditions on the first piece were x if x is less than 1. Okay. So we will put in x. Now how do we get to the less than key? That is under the key called test, because we are testing a condition. And notice it's a raised key, so we have to push the second button to activate it. So second test. And that gives us all the inequality keys. Okay. So we would like x less than, so the less than key is number 5, so we'll press option 5. And remember, we want x less than 1, and then we'll close the parentheses on that. So that gives us our first piece, 3x minus 1 defined on the inputs for x less than 1. Now we want to type in the second piece. And to do that, we will use the plus key. And then we'll type our second piece in parentheses. So recall our second piece was 2x plus 5. So 2 times x plus 5. Close the parentheses. And immediately following that second piece, we'll type in parentheses the conditions to use the second piece. And remember, the condition was x greater than or equal to 1. So x, to get the inequality symbols, remember we use the test, which is above math, second math. Now the option we want is greater than or equal to, so that's option 4, so we'll press 4. 1, and close the parentheses. So we have entered both pieces. So we will press enter. And now to see the graph, we will just push the graph button. And there is a piecewise defined function. Okay. Now again, we'll have to talk about the endpoints of this because the calculator resolution doesn't allow to tell you what happens at the endpoints. Now suppose we want to graph a piecewise defined function that has more than 2 pieces. That's a little more complicated. So let's go back to the y equals screen. Clear out the function we have there. Let me clear the key press history. So suppose we want to graph this function that has 3 pieces. So suppose it's f of x defined in 3 pieces. The function is defined by x if x is less than or equal to 0. It's defined by 2x if x is between 0 and 4. And it's defined by 1 minus 2x if x is greater than 4. So suppose we want to graph that function. So this would have 3 pieces. It's a little more complicated, but we can do it. So we are in our y equals screen. So just like before, we will type our pieces in, followed by the inequalities. So our first piece is x when x is less than or equal to 0. So let's type in parentheses, x. And now the parentheses that follow it is the condition. So x. And remember, to get the inequality symbols, it's test, because we're testing a condition. And since it is a raised key, we need the second button. So second test. We want less than or equal to, so that's option 6. 0, close that condition. Plus, to go to the next condition, in parentheses, 2 times x, close the parentheses. Now we'll put in the condition. Now the condition is x is greater than 0 and x is less than or equal to 4. To do that condition on the calculator, we need to write it as 2 separate conditions. So x greater than 0 and x less than or equal to 4. That is how we'll do it on the calculator. So, parentheses, 0, and we're using the test menu again. So 0 less than less than is option 5. X, close that condition. Start the next condition, which remember is x less than or equal to 4. So we have our parentheses there already. X, second test, less than or equal to is option 6. 4, close the parentheses on that condition. Now we will add in our last piece, so plus, and our last piece is 1 minus 2x, in parentheses, 1 minus 2 times x. Close the parentheses on that piece, open the parentheses on the condition, which is x greater than 4. So second test greater than is option 3. Oops, you can see there I'm messed up by not putting the x in. So I forgot to type in my x, so let's go back and fix that. So we can use the arrow key to go back. And now I will put in the x. And now I'll fix it. So x greater than 4. So x, second test, greater than is option 3, 4, and close the parentheses on that condition. And that fills in all of our pieces, so we press enter. And there is our graph after we press the graph button. First piece is coming in, there's the second piece, and you can see the third piece down there. Now again, the calculator does not have the resolution to talk about what happens at the endpoint, so that's something you have to do for yourself. So that is graphing piecewise defined functions. So now we know how to graph functions. In future lessons, we will look at more things with graphing, but let's just stop here for this one. Those are the basics of graphing functions.